morning. I wrote my bachelor's essay on a normative analysis of abolishing or reforming the police. And basically this just came out of the past couple of years of the news. Really, there are instances of police brutality and murder at the hands of the police pretty often, far too often in the past year specifically. So here's my argument outline. I start with going through the theory and repositioning where we think we are in theory. And then I'll go through the practical problems with the police, eventually talking about solutions to the policing problem, really going through the debate between reform and abolition, ultimately coming to the conclusion that we have to abolish the police. So this is liberal democratic theory. This is where most people think we are in our American democracy. It's founded in egalitarian principles of fairness and equality and democratic ideals, the idea that the government is supposed to protect citizens from abuse. And I argue that this isn't the case. This isn't really where we're at, because if we were here, the police wouldn't be. The police have no position in this form of theory, because the police are a privileged class of individuals who are completely unelected, so they have no legitimate basis for this privileged class. And they're permitted to harm and kill other citizens with little to no accountability. So they can do it with impunity. And so if liberal democratic theory is not reflective of where we are in our society, I argue that white democracy is. And so this is a term coined by Joel Olson, and it posits that the American democracy that we know is so predicated on the success of the white privileged class that it requires racial oppression in order for that white citizen to succeed. So this says that things like the institution of slavery or Chinese exclusion laws or really any American practice of discrimination, they're not violations of the American ethos. They're actually really compatible with our American democracy and how we view our society. So I argue that, we started with liberal democratic theory. We figured out that that's not really reflective of where we are, so we are repositioning ourselves at a white democracy. So now that we found out our problem and where we stand in political theory, we have to figure out what tool we can use to combat this problem. And I argue that it's abolition democracy. So this is a term coined by W.E.B. Du Bois and was later popularized by Angela Davis. And it basically says that the only response that we can have to heteropatriarchal white supremacist institutions is to tear down all of those oppressive systems and then replace them with comprehensive systems of justice. And so usually there are multiple systems in place. And so that's something that I'll get to when it comes to the solution to the policing problem. So now that we have our tool to white democracy, what is the final goal? I argue that if we use abolition democracy successfully and comprehensively, then eventually we'll be able to arrive at liberal democratic theory for the first time, specific to the policing problem, because there's a bunch more work we have to do. So we've talked about theory, now we have to talk about the practical problems with the police, and so the way that I'm going to do it is by taking assumptions that most people have about the police and then breaking them down. So the first assumption is that the police are here to protect everyone, and that's not the case. And I emphasize everyone because there are so many communities who don't feel protected by the police, they don't feel safe around the police. And some statistics to back that up is that from May 25th, 2020 to June 4th, 2020, so about 2 weeks, the police arrested over 9,300 people in relation to the George Floyd protests, and most of them were journalists or medical professionals who were just trying to help people. So in this time where people are speaking out against police's abuses of power, the police abused their power and arrested nearly 10,000 people, and that's absurd. So the first week of June 2020, 463 people were killed by the hands of the police. And then if you take an even larger step back and look bigger picture, in the year of 2020, 1,127 people were killed by the police. 28% of that number were black people, they were black Americans, even though the black community only makes up 13% of the US population. So the police are not here to protect everyone. If anything, they are targeting specific groups. The second assumption is that the system is broken, and that's what we hope, right? I mean, those statistics from the last slide were awful, and if something is broken, that means we can fix it. But that's not the case. I argue that the system of the police and the policing institution is actually doing exactly what it was designed to do, and it's doing it really, really well. So if we talk about the origins of the police in the United States, and specifically in the South, they come from slave patrols. So a group of white, privileged men came together and created this system where it was designed to capture and return enslaved people who were trying to escape. And then once the Compromise of 1877 happened, Reconstruction began, slave patrols officially couldn't, happen anymore. So they dissolved into white militia groups. Time went on, the civil rights movement happened, society progressed, kind of. And you couldn't have white militia groups anymore. And so eventually that dissolved a little bit less reductively than how I have the time to explain, into individuals with these ideas becoming a part of official functions of the government, like the police department. So the system isn't broken. The police have always been designed to be a weapon of the state in order to oppress specific groups and uphold a white privileged class. And the last assumption is that we need the police. And this, again, isn't the case. There are multiple communities who are more afraid of the police than of any harm that could befall them, and so they never call the police. But the assumption is a big one. So what happens if you are sexually assaulted? Who do you go to? You don't go to the police. So only 1/3 of survivors actually report a sexual assault, and the vast majority of them never find a answer that's actually satisfying. And a study in 2010 found that sexual misconduct was the second most reported form of police misconduct, and a study in 2015 found that a police officer was caught in some form of sexual misconduct every 5 days across the United States. So the police are not innocent. The system that has brought them up has created such entitlement and this illusion of authority and power that they have now become perpetrators, or have always been perpetrators. And so this idea that the police are synonymous with something like safety, we have to disrupt that. That's not the case. And so there's something wrong with the police, right? We'll start with some solutions. We have to reform it. I argue that we shouldn't reform it. And so I take the 8 Can't Wait campaign. So this is a group called Campaign Zero came up with these 8 suggestions of how to solve the policing problem through reform. And so it goes from, banning chokeholds and strangleholds all the way to requiring police officers to comprehensively report their actions, which is something they should be doing already. And it doesn't work, right? So in 1993, New York City banned chokeholds, and then in 2014, Eric Gardner died from being placed in a chokehold by a police officer. So you can put in these policies, but there's no form of accountability there. And the problem with the 8 Can't Wait campaign and reform in general is that it says that the system at large is legitimate, save for a few things that can be tweaked. And it completely fails to address the systemic issues of racism, sexism, insert your ism, that were built into the system. And it fails to account for the fact that these police officers have extraordinary power over ordinary citizens, which should not be the case. And so I argue that there's actually something really wrong with the police and that the system is not legitimate whatsoever. And so we have to abolish it. And so after the 8 Can't Wait campaign came out, the 8 to Abolition campaign came out. And so these are larger suggestions. They're more systemic. So defunding the police or providing safe housing for everyone. They're larger. They'll take more time. And in my essay, I actually go through and dissect each of the 8 components and why we need them, but I don't have the time right now. So generally what this campaign does is it works to eliminate the police, obviously, and it does so by investing in communities and by investing in care in order to empower people to take community accountability more as a group consensus, a non-coercive measure to keep people safe. And so I argue that the only way that we can actually arrive to those principles that liberal democratic theory posits, equality, fairness, justice, is by abolishing the police completely. Thank you.